Why does the world suddenly feel less stable than it used to? Why do economic shocks spread faster across countries? Why do trade conflicts intensify? Why does geopolitical tension seem to rise across multiple regions at the same time? This is not the first time societies have experienced this feeling. The Roman Empire once controlled much of the known world. The British Empire governed global trade routes across continents. After World War II, the United States emerged as the dominant global power of the modern era. And during each period, the existing order often felt stable, natural, and difficult to imagine changing. But history repeatedly shows that no dominant power remains permanently at the center of the global system. Power shifts. And when it does, the transition is often turbulent for the societies living through it. Major shifts in global power rarely emerge from a single event. They usually develop slowly as the systems that once created expansion, stability, and dominance become increasingly difficult to sustain. So why do great powers rise? Why do they eventually struggle to maintain the systems they once built? And why do periods of global transition often create instability across the world at the same time? This is not a new pattern. The Roman Empire, the British Empire, and other dominant powers all experienced periods of expansion, global influence, rising complexity, and eventual strain. The pattern repeats across civilizations and across time. It happens not because societies suddenly become weak, but because expansion itself gradually creates systems that become more expensive, more rigid, and more difficult to maintain over time. In this episode, you'll understand how economic expansion, institutional growth, debt, military reach, legitimacy, and systemic complexity interact across long historical cycles of rising and declining global power, and why great powers often struggle not at the moment of decline, but at the height of their dominance. So the question is, what happens when the systems that created global dominance begin becoming harder to sustain? Across this module, we've explored how complex societies become more fragile from the inside: institutional decay, declining trust, social fragmentation, systemic dysfunction. But these pressures don't stay inside individual societies. Over long periods, they also reshape the balance of power between civilizations themselves. And once dominant powers become increasingly dependent on maintaining vast economic, political, military, and institutional systems, the cost of maintaining global dominance itself begins rising. At first, rising powers are highly adaptive. They industrialize rapidly, expand trade networks, build strong institutions, increase productivity, develop new technologies, expand military and financial influence. Growth creates more growth. Power creates more power. Influence creates larger systems of coordination and dependency. But as dominance expands, the system becomes its own constraint. Trade systems grow larger. Military commitments expand across wider regions. Financial systems become deeply interconnected. Institutions become more bureaucratic. Political coordination becomes more difficult. And maintaining the system itself eventually requires enormous amounts of energy, resources, coordination, and stability. This is one of the paradoxes of hegemonic cycles. The systems that helped create dominance during earlier periods of expansion can gradually become constraints during later periods of maintenance. The institutional decay we explored earlier in this module now operates at civilizational scale. Military systems become expensive to sustain globally. Financial systems become increasingly dependent on confidence. Political systems struggle to balance competing internal interests. And societies that once expanded through flexibility and innovation gradually become focused on preserving the existing order. Daily life may still appear stable, markets still operate, global influence still appears enormous, but underneath, structural pressure is already building, debt rising faster than productive growth, coordination costs increasing, internal political conflict intensifying, trust in institutions weakening. The same fragmentation and trust breakdown we examined earlier in this module, now visible at the scale of the dominant power itself. And eventually, maintaining dominance itself begins requiring more stabilization simply to preserve the existing system. This is often the stage where rising challengers begin gaining ground. Not because the dominant power suddenly collapses, but because newer powers are often still operating during earlier phases of expansion, with lower coordination costs, newer infrastructure, rising productivity, and more adaptive systems. Relative strength begins shifting, and once that shift begins, the global system itself can become increasingly unstable. Trade conflicts intensify, currency systems come under pressure, alliances begin shifting, competition over technology, resources, finance, and influence accelerates. And because dominant powers sit at the center of so many interconnected systems, instability inside the hegemonic center can spread throughout the wider international order. History repeatedly shows this pattern. The Roman Empire expanded across vast territories but eventually struggled under the growing costs of administration, military defense, and internal fragmentation. The British Empire once sat at the center of global trade, finance, and naval power, but maintaining a worldwide imperial system became increasingly expensive as industrial competition, debt, and geopolitical rivalry intensified. And during the 20th century, the United States emerged as the dominant economic, military, financial, and technological power of the modern era. In each case, the dominant power remained extremely powerful, even while structural pressures were already accumulating underneath. Because hegemonic decline is rarely experienced as a sudden moment. It is usually experienced as a long period where maintaining the existing order becomes increasingly difficult, expensive, and politically divisive. People living through these transitions often experience a growing sense that the world their parents understood is becoming less predictable, less stable, and harder to recognize. Hegemonic transitions also create instability far beyond the dominant power itself. Global trade systems, reserve currencies, financial markets, military alliances, supply chains, and international institutions are all deeply connected to the existing order. When confidence in that order weakens, uncertainty spreads throughout the wider global structure as well, financial volatility increasing, trade relationships becoming less predictable, strategic rivalries expanding into technology, energy, finance, and information systems. And because modern societies are now more interconnected than at any point in history, instability spreads faster than in earlier hegemonic transitions. The same cascading dynamic we examined in the Tipping Points episode of this module, now operating at the scale of the global order itself. Dominant powers often attempt to stabilize these pressures through further intervention, more debt to sustain growth, more institutional coordination to maintain stability, more military reach to preserve geopolitical influence. And sometimes these measures succeed temporarily. But maintaining stability eventually requires continuously increasing levels of coordination and management, because the system is no longer expanding as easily as it once did. It is preserving an already highly complex global order under growing pressure. This is one of the defining characteristics of late-stage hegemonic systems. Expansion gradually shifts into maintenance. Adaptability gradually shifts into preservation. And systems originally built to project power outward increasingly become focused on stabilizing pressure inward. Not because leaders necessarily intend this outcome, but because maintaining a vast and interconnected global system becomes increasingly difficult once complexity, fragmentation, debt, institutional rigidity, and geopolitical competition all begin reinforcing each other simultaneously. This does not necessarily mean collapse is inevitable. Some societies adapt successfully, some reform institutions, some manage transitions gradually rather than catastrophically. But history suggests that hegemonic systems rarely remain permanently stable once the pressures created during expansion begin exceeding the system's ability to manage them. And once confidence in the existing order weakens broadly enough, the transition itself can become one of the largest sources of instability in the global system. Once you see this pattern, you begin recognizing it in specific signals. The first is rising maintenance costs. When increasing amounts of debt, coordination, military reach, or institutional management are required simply to preserve the existing system. The second is declining adaptability, when dominant institutions become slower, more rigid, and less capable of responding effectively to changing conditions. The third is geopolitical fragmentation, when trade systems, alliances, financial structures, and strategic interests begin drifting into competing blocs and rival power centers. These are not necessarily signs that a dominant power is about to collapse. They are signs that the global order itself may be entering a period of increasing structural pressure and transition. Hegemonic cycles do not emerge from a single cause. They emerge from the long interaction between expansion, complexity, coordination, debt, legitimacy, and shifting relative power across civilizations over time. And because dominant powers sit at the center of increasingly interconnected global systems, pressures inside the hegemonic core can reshape the wider international order around them. History shows this pattern repeatedly. Periods of expansion create systems of extraordinary power, coordination, and prosperity. But over time, the same systems that once accelerated growth become increasingly difficult to sustain. And as complexity, fragmentation, debt, institutional rigidity, and geopolitical competition begin reinforcing each other simultaneously, the global order itself can begin entering periods of instability and transition. Not because history moves in straight lines, but because civilizations, like all complex systems, remain subject to cycles of expansion, adaptation, pressure, and change. Hegemonic cycles are part of TNBC Explainers, Module 4. Systems, Complexity, and Decline. This is TNBC Explainers, understanding how the world actually works. Explore the TNBC Explainers course via the YouTube course list or visit thenextbigcycle.world for the full course overview and background. This is The Next Big Cycle, TNBC Explainers, your guide to understanding the systems shaping the world around you. TNBC Explainers is a growing YouTube course where new concepts are added over time.